Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Please take a minute, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and most importantly, share it. Invite folks into this conversation. I know that a lot of us need this conversation right now, need to hear what we'll be discussing today. Support us on Patreon as well. There's a promo code for a discount on your first month or year. So anyways, that's in the show description. My guest today will be Abdaljawad Omar. Again, grateful to be here with him. I actually lost count. I think the last time we did this conversation and said we'd talked like 18 times, and I think it was 16. So I believe this is 17 now. But it's always an honor to host him and to have these conversations. Today we're going to talk about kind of the state of the situation, war, genocide, ethnic cleansing, as it relates to Gaza, as it relates to the Palestinian cause, Palestinian liberation. We're going to talk a little bit about the protests that took place in Gaza it's like a little over a week ago, I think, at this point, that got a lot of media attention in the West. Discuss some of the analysis of them, including a piece that Abdaljawad wrote for Mondoweiss that's really excellent. I mean, his writing is always great, but I really encourage people to read it. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the climate of suppression of dissent, I guess, within the United States, as well as a little bit of some of these discussions or debates about what should people in the United States be doing right now. And a little bit more. So anyway, Abdaljawad, great to be with you. It's always good to have you on the show. I can't believe you mentioned before we started that it's been since January, and I didn't even realize it had been quite that long. But it's great to be with you again and have this discussion.
Thanks, Jared. It's always a pleasure to be with you as well.
Yeah, so I think we'd just start by talking a little bit about like setting the context that we're in, understanding where things sit right now with Gaza. Obviously, there's, Israel has been violating the ceasefire for about a month now, several weeks. I mean, it kind of always did, but it escalated its violations of the ceasefire, and more probably urgently has like placed Gaza under total siege. So, there's no aid or food or anything like that getting in. And that's been going on for weeks now, which is, leading to, famine, type situation and things like this. And so, yeah, I just talk a little bit about your analysis of where things sit from that perspective.
Well, I mean, since the signing of the ceasefire agreement, one could have anticipated the fact that Israel would resume its war in a different guise, at least using its standing firepower, specifically air power, while also being averse to the entry of soldiers back into the Gaza Strip because of the repercussions of fighting on the ground, which would lead to more damage to its troops and of course its military equipment, tanks and vehicles and other forms of infantry type of equipments that the Israeli army have. Thus far, what we have seen is that Israel resumed this kind of pressure campaign that include the siege tactic, of course, and the bombardment of Gaza from air. With some planning that one could point towards, which in essence still opens the space for an Israeli control of the Gaza Strip and perhaps even the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip as well. Of course, Israel's leaving that quite ambiguous because it seems that there's kind of a dual play in terms of military strategy at this current moment in Israeli thinking. On the one hand, it wants to extract more of the Israeli captives and prisoners in the Gaza Strip without paying a price in ending the war totally. But on the other hand, it's also seeking to entrench the idea that Gaza is uninhabitable, that it will not be able to be rebuilt, that people will face dire conditions in terms of life, even in the wake of war. and also opening the space for settlements within the Gaza Strip or control and what they're calling voluntary immigration, but of course it's ethnic cleansing based on the fact that there's nothing left for you in Gaza, maybe you should leave. So this is at least the Israeli discourse at this moment, and I think that to some degree, it informs some of the planning around, negotiating through force and fire, but at the same time, making sure that there's actually concrete plans that might transpire around, taking hold of the Gaza Strip or permitting the form of ethnic cleansing under different guises that could unfold in the future. So this is the conditions now. I think from an Israeli perspective, having somebody like Trump who supports them rhetorically on this question is also fundamental and important. Having this counterinsurgency campaign, arise in the United States against, the Palestine movement in its different guises and shapes and form, the attack against institutions like the universities, the attack against, the student movement, deportations, are also part of, hammering down against any form of dissent around America's backing of Israel on this. But this is the situation, at least when it comes to Gaza specifically. I mean, a third component of it is that Israel still wants to open the space for an attack against Iran in the coming months or weeks. It probably needs, there is a discussion around that. It will probably need for war to continue just to open that space and convince the Americans to go along with the attack, or at least allow Israel to do the attack, in the near future. So there is that question as well that is related to, will Israel or the United States or both countries attack Iran in the near future? Or will also reach a negotiated settlement around the nuclear program that Iran has, but also around different, issues tied to the Iranian regime and the ability of the regime to build, influence in the region and back a lot of the groups that we have seen throughout this war fight, or at least try to back Gaza, like Ansar Allah in Yemen or Hezbollah in Lebanon. So there's all of these files on a regional level that the Americans are engaging with, also in attacking Ansar Allah, as we've seen with the single gate, the signal group that Trump administration officials had. But I think more importantly, what is really uncertain is the fact: will Israel turn this relative strength it has at this current moment, its strategic position, to an agreed solution with the region and other parties, even if that solution is more favorable to Israel? And it seems to me that Israel is struggling with itself on that question, because on the one hand, the architecture in the region for any settling of the war and any normalization agreements and even peace agreements with Lebanon or Syria or any of these other countries that we have been speaking about in the past 16 or 17 episodes that we have dealt with. Israel will need to be pragmatic on a lot of different questions, including the question of Palestinians and their everyday life within the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And it seems to me that Israel's priority is to maintain this openness of war, of various potentialities happening, but not very certain where it's actually going to head, even with its tactical and some of the strategic successes that it actually was able to extract in its war, specifically against Hezbollah, and of course with the downfall of the Assad regime and its replacement with a new regime in Syria. So it's a very uncertain moment, because I think there is a bit of hubris in Israeli mentality right now, where the security network that actually operates on a defining Israel's strategy is clashing on some level with Israeli desire to decisively end the Palestinian question. And these are two conflicting stances at this current point, because on the one hand, while Netanyahu is gaining a lot of credence by conducting a coup in Israel itself against, the legal institution in Israel, against the liberal center of left Zionists who have established the state and set it up institutionally, allowing this kind of war of position to take place, where the right wing entrenches itself and redefines the relationship between the executive and the legal branch. There is still much on the plate in terms of how Israel is acting that is actually pure, that operates on the level of pure desire and maintaining the possibility of ethnic cleansing or some sort of decisive end to the Palestinian question. And it hits a brick wall, because that brick wall is not necessarily undefeatable, but the brick wall is actually around this regional architecture that Americans have created since 1945, and was reinforced through peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan, and was reinforced even further with Trump's, Abrahamic Accords that occurred a couple of years ago. So what that means is that Israel, on the one hand, needs to get rid of the Palestinians, but at the same time, to do that, it will endanger some of the countries or neighboring countries around its borders, and they're trying to find inventive solutions. The Trump administration apparently, and Israelis were speaking to African countries where, Palestinians could be thrown into some country in Africa. There are some maneuvers around, perhaps, allowing or ethnically cleansing the Palestinians, whether in the West Bank and Gaza, to some other country that will not disturb Jordan's balance or Egypt's, for that regard, and making sure that the Palestinians cannot really mount a struggle from outside of Palestine against Israel, even if they're ethnically cleansed. But these are all plans that are hard to actually really enact or find willing partners with Israel to actually completely, buy into such a program. And on the other hand, it is in a place where it can turn this kind of relative strategic strength that it has displayed in this war, one that is not necessarily out of Israeli ingenuity or military genius, but out of sheer brutality and its reliance on American industrial base that has supplanted it with all the weapons that it needs to transgress every norm of war that we have seen unroll. But that relative strategic military, let's say, triumph that Israel has been able to achieve needs some sort of political resolution. And what we're not seeing at this particular moment is what does Israel really want. So it's still hinging that war helps the right wing entrench itself politically and internally within Israel itself, conducting the coup at home, maintains Netanyahu's power, but at the same time, on another level, it's engaging in this perpetual opening of possibilities for a decisive end of the Palestinians. We should remember, Jared, that for the right-wing Israeli settlers, the main priority is not Iran, it's the Palestinians and decisively ending the question of Palestine. So for people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, what they are concerned about mostly is the idea of expanding settlements, of getting rid of the Palestinians, of minimizing the demographic threat of Palestinian presence in the land of Palestine. This is what they're thinking about. This is what they obsess about. This is the primary agenda they have: returning to Gaza as settlers, or engaging in genocide or ethnic cleansing, whatever works to get rid of the Palestinians and erase them, or at least find a way to completely suffocate the Palestinian cause so nobody talks about it anymore or actually mentions it. And the priorities of the military and perhaps strategic establishment is more related to this contest with Iran and with the strategic makeup that they're trying to create. So a lot of these tensions are boiling around Israeli hubris, feeling the sense of victory and this kind of victorious speech and discourse, and then prolonging the war, perpetually maintaining it, and not sure what the end game is in terms of how Israel is moving about in this war. There's nothing really that significantly has changed in Gaza, where you would say a new military campaign with completely eradicate, for instance, armed resistance, or whether they will see, a breakthrough in, with Egypt that allows Palestinians to enter Egypt and ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. So we're not seeing signs of something changing the game radically, but it's only just pressuring the people more, making them suffer more, enacting more pain sadistically, and see if that works to, finally turning the people of Gaza against the resistance, or simply make Gaza completely uninhabitable, so that for most Gazans, the question of leaving Gaza becomes their primary concern.
Thank you for all of that, setting the table. So I think so I want to pivot to your piece, which I think again is like I really recommend people read it. Excellently written piece. And this was about the protests which took place in Gaza, which were highly publicized. Western media picked it up, New York Times, and so on. And obviously, it should be noteworthy to folks that Western media doesn't usually cover protests related to Palestine or Palestinian protests. It's not something that it has done over the last, 17, 18 months of this genocide, certainly. Your piece delves into, the conditions in Gaza, some of which you've laid out right now, which, create a climate for such protests, as well as the alignment that they ultimately have, or how they can be absorbed within an Israeli campaign of psychological warfare, which I'm sure we'll talk about, which is obviously, again, why we see so much media coverage, is that these protests, in certain ways, or at least the way that they're being portrayed within Western media, aligns with, the U.S. and Israeli agenda. And so the thing I wanted to start, though, is just kind of there's a different take on this too. So Electronic Intifada, for instance, in their live stream last week, and there's a shortened component just kind of focused on this that I'll put in the show description as well, where, they see these protests as really being astroturfed, or not being kind of organic to people in Gaza. Not to say that they aren't people in Gaza that are in the protests, but to say that, it doesn't represent some grassroots, like, larger turn against Hamas in Gaza. And so, you, I think, took a slightly different angle about that. Obviously, you're also still talking about some of the same dynamics that I think that Electronic Intifada is diving into with the piece, in terms of some of the actors involved, the relationship to Fatah, and kind of powerful families who might benefit from a political restructuring in Gaza. Anyway, I'm just curious, kind of your take on that, and kind of why you took the assessment that you have of the protests themselves and the folks that are involved.
Well, look, I mean, I'm quite antagonistic towards any form of analysis that simply, tries to completely delegitimize an act. I'm not saying that these protests are organic or not. I mean, that was not the main question. What is central here, I think, for most people to grasp, is that for most people in Gaza, the question of Hamas and armed resistance, which is discussed outside of Gaza, I don't think it's a central question at all. I think that for people in Gaza, that the primary concern for them is for the war to end, and for the killing and the massacres and the repetitions to end. So in that sense, the protests do, encapsulate this desire for certainty, for life without bombardment, for life without massacres, for life without this condition of perpetually being displaced, and that is an organic desire that we cannot, completely jump over. That's one level of it. The second level of it is that for 17 months or so, we've seen, the war machine enacting its brutality against Gaza and its people. And also for a lot of people within Gaza, they haven't really seen in their eyes that a lot of the other Palestinians, whether in the West Bank and within 1948 or Jerusalem, for a lot of different reasons, have really been able to meet the demand of this moment politically, or try to back Gaza in a more proactive sense. Of course, there's a lot of fear. Fear leads to paralysis. There's a lot of guilt and shame, and that all operate on some level within the West Bank, Jerusalem, and 1948. But for a lot of people in Gaza, they feel abandoned, or they feel that their fellow Palestinians have not really met the demand of the moment politically. So that's another issue that also is at play, at least psychologically, for many in Gaza. The third thing, Jared, is that Israel has enacted a brutal campaign that also wanted to decapitate Hamas's ability to govern Gaza, which means that there's a bit of a vacuum in terms of the presence of police force, in terms of managing society, preventing crime, things that Gazan society more broadly haven't really dealt with, and we're seeing signs of cracks. Now, when I say cracks, it's nothing like the crime rate in major cities or metropolitan cities in the West, for instance. But still, in terms of this kind of feeling that things are becoming insecure, there's a lot of exploitation. Merchants are upping their prices. On an everyday level, life within the horizon of this genocide, also getting what you need in terms of food, in terms of the ability to survive, is also unmanaged or mismanaged, or in many areas also incapable of being managed, and that leaves an opening for foreign actors who have an organic presence with Gaza, including Fatah and other actors, to play a more proactive role, betting on the idea that people want the end of the war, betting on people's being throughout 17 months, all their savings are gone. There's they lost their homes, they lost a lot of their assets. Betting on the fact that what people care about the most right now is an end of the war, rather than any political slogan such as armed resistance or anything like that. For a lot of Palestinians in Gaza, they see as not the main slogan for them today. And I think on that level, the question of whether these protests are organic or not, or artificially, constructed or directed, becomes less important, because even if they're not, organic, and I do agree with that analysis that outside actors and players and families have a role in that, and that's why I mentioned it. The question is, why is that their discourse resonates, at least with many in Gaza, even among people who support the resistance, and we've seen signs of that. I know a lot of the journalists, the political, let's say, opinion makers within Gaza that have stood with the resistance and throughout the war, who have also started to complain more and more about the conditions of life within the Gaza Strip, not really hinting towards fault or responsibilities on the part of the armed resistance, but at the same time is still pushing back against some of the practices that resistance have been using, including, for instance, firing rockets towards Israel, which is becoming more and more consensus around it, that it's not necessarily at this particular moment. There's more pushback, let's say, and it's not coming from people within Fatah or coming from people who are antagonistic towards Hamas, but also from Palestinian, let's say, influencers and political opinion makers that are generally seen as having a stance with the resistance more broadly. So I think we've seen some signs of that. Again, I don't think that people are turning against Hamas, or that there's a grassroots movement that wants to upend Hamas, because at the same time that this war is happening, most Palestinians, whether in Gaza or outside of Gaza, realize that even surrender will not actually save us. That's not the Israeli plan. If Netanyahu has declared quite clearly that what we want or intend to do in Gaza is to ethnically cleanse Gaza, then what you're bargaining, at least with Israel is basically the terms of your ethnic cleansing, how you will be ethnically cleansed. That's the only thing that maybe the Israelis will discuss with you. But other than that, I mean, I think for most Palestinians at this current moment, that feeling, that desire for certainty is the primary, mode of thinking. And I think beyond the political sloganeering, that's a reality on the ground in Gaza. That's when you speak to people in Gaza, that's how most people feel. It doesn't mean that people will not, stand steadfast, will not, fight, not necessarily out of an option, because it's the only option that is available, really. But at the same time, that's a reality. And I think the piece tries to balance between that desire, which interplays with psychological warfare, because we should make quite clear is that psychological warfare only works if the message resonates. No, if the message is ridiculous or absurd, it's not going to really, sit deep down within you and have an impact on your view or perception of the world, or your cognition of the actors and what each one is doing or not doing. But if the message has some resonance, then it could operate or could have an impact on your belief in yourself, trust in yourself, or trust in the actors that are, engaging in this fight on your behalf. And I would say that from the outset of this war, our forces within Fatah, for instance, have been engaging in a psychological warfare campaign within Gaza and outside of Gaza. And they are Gazans. So they have been engaged in this war against resistance, against armed resistance, against Hamas, against, October 7th, against the decision to try and enter history that was taken October 7th with the Tufan al-Aqsa. This is nothing new, but the basic point is that this idea of cooperation, this discourse of collaboration, this discourse of not asserting ourselves within history has become more and more resonant as the war has continued. It doesn't mean that the resistance has lost all of its support or that people don't believe in resistance, but this is a moment where, both the sacred and profane in people's eyes become one. It's genocide creates this where you don't feel that values or looking at somebody in a specific way and in a specific criteria where you judge a person to be, for instance, good or bad or evil or patriotic or whatever it is. These forms of judgment now become confused and people are more disoriented. This is a moment where people are yearning for survival, are seeing their loved ones being killed every day, are within this element of a whirlwind or a storm that is uprooting also a lot of the people's thinking and discourse and beliefs as the war continues. And I think that at this particular moment, it's easy for new discourses and information to infiltrate people's sensibility and cognition and perception of the world and what's happening around them. So it's a very dangerous moment on that level. It's a very dangerous moment on the level of, those who argue for resistance or intellectually defend it also within Palestine. I mean, it's not necessarily that people want to surrender or want to become collaborators or all of these different elements that go into that, but it's also a moment where those who defend or intellectually have a stance or practice or any form of practice around resistance are facing pushback from people, because people are looking at this and they don't want sloganeering, they don't want people to theorize or to give them lectures around values and nationalism and liberation, as much as they want a solution for everyday life and what's happening on the ground and concretely and materially that could enhance their livelihoods and, of course, end the war machine and its onslaught on Gaza as it moves on. So I think that's the dissonance, and I think it's important that we recognize that despite the fact that resistance is still strong and still operating, and also the governing apparatus has not completely disappeared, that the pain and onslaught that has been happening 7 months have an accumulative effect on people's perception, cognition, and of course beliefs and values. And that is not something we should take lightly, because then you'll just bury yourself bury yourself and not look at how things are changing in different ways as well. The only thing that helps resistance is the fact that Israel is not pragmatic. Like, it's more of Israel's doing rather than necessarily the argument that we're arguing amongst ourselves. Is the fact that Israel is not pragmatic enough to basically ease Palestinian concerns and anxiety around, for instance, ethnic cleansing, or because they wanted this kind of decisive end of the war, they create the conditions in which people still stick to resistance even more broadly on a pragmatic level. So I think that is also a recognition that also resistance is not coming out of this kind of infrastructure of values or emotions necessarily only. It's also coming from the fact that the enemy is not giving a leeway or a space in many ways for those who argue for cooperation to actually have a standing amongst their people. And despite all the moves of Fatah and the families and the clans, it's not successful. It's not that successful in terms of being able to really organize an active movement that is capable of taking power, for instance, or being able to completely shift public opinion against armed resistance, or being able to completely shift and invert people's values and otherwise. It's not as successful, because even if people don't like Hamas, guess what? They hate Fatah even more. That's also the dynamic of what's happening, and of course they hate that Fatah also didn't take a stance to back Gaza from the West Bank, where it should have done more towards the people of Gaza, whether on a financial level, whether on a political level, whether on whatever level that is possible. So there's a lot of levels to what's going on in Gaza, but I think what is really organic about it, and what most people share, is this desire for certainty for the end of the war. And I think that's the main priority, at least on a everyday public sentiment level.
Thank you for all of that. Just wanted to respond to some stuff in the chat quickly. So PJ, yeah, I think people should watch the EI piece, and I think they should read Abduljawad's piece. It's not really, I'm not trying to put them in antagonism with each other. I think they're both important and people should check out both. But there is kind of, I think, a nuanced difference in the emphasis in the two pieces, and that's kind of what I wanted to talk about a little bit here. Alex, good to see you, my friend. These are solid insights on how material conditions in the present are shifting and destroying fabric of Gaza and society and culture. One of the main legacies of civil wars in Central America was the destruction of the social fabric and a constant state of mistrust that didn't exist in those ways in any given country impacted by Western aggression. All right. So I'm going to read a quote real quick from your piece here. So, which again, great writing. This schism would come to play a dominant role in Palestinian political discourse in the wake of Tufan al-Aqsa, gradually polarizing both intellectual and political debate around three interrelated binaries: victory and defeat, responsibility and abandonment, resistance and survival. This discourse, however, was not wholly internal. It was also shaped, if not actively engineered, through sustained information and psychological warfare, particularly via Arab media outlets funded by Gulf countries that sought to assign responsibility for Israel's genocidal campaign to the resistance itself. In these narratives, defeat, that's in quotes, was not merely an outcome, but a permanent condition, a political horizon into which Palestinians were meant to settle, disarmed, disillusioned, and disciplined. So, yeah, I wanted to talk about this a little bit, and a little bit about how, one, what you're highlighting here, and kind of the larger propaganda campaign that you are talking about in the piece, right, which is to assign blame, which I think is, it dovetails very much with obviously how this has been talked about in the West, in the US, specifically by the United States government, both in the Biden administration and in the Trump administration. Recently, I don't remember which one of the Trump toadies it was that said, something along the lines that they were asking about the medics, the paramedics and things that have been slaughtered and executed in Rafah. And, she had no response other than everything that happens in Gaza is Hamas's fault. Like everything, and that was perhaps not any different than the message that we've been receiving all along. But at the same time, it was maybe more direct than that message has been conveyed in a while, at least.
Yeah, I mean,
you go ahead.
I mean, look, I mean that is a that has been an ideological, rhetorical stance that anybody who's trying to defend Israel is using. I mean, there are more subtle arguments, that some are making. With, for example, people like the New York Times, they just ignore these episodes. They just don't talk about it or leave it out. So they choose to not highlight it. With others, it's more, everything that happens in Gaza is Hamas's fault. And I think that, we've spoken about this in early on, because I claimed from the outset that one of the fundamentally different, aspect of the decision on October 7th to engage in this, offensive military maneuver within the Gaza envelope, or the settlements that surround and besiege the Gaza Strip, was that generally within Palestine, at least, people make decisions all the time, not to get me wrong, but that this type of decision on that level and that intensity was never one that can be assigned to 2, 3, or 4 people, who lead a movement. So this is what's qualitatively different about intifadas, for instance, as a spontaneous eruption, where there's, where people argue about who started the first intifada, still till this day, between different political parties. We started it. No, we started it. But nobody can really take the full on responsibility for it. When it comes to this episode, there's that decision, and it's a decision to, produce Palestinians as subjects of history and to enter history. And I think one of the elements of Israeli counter-information campaign, or misinformation and disinformation, cognitive operations and psychological warfare, is to make Palestinians regret this decision, to basically completely disavow it and reject it as a adventurous decision, as a moment of madness, as something that should have not been decided in the first place, etc., etc., etc. That's exactly the whole Israeli strategy. It's for us to reject the decision on the part of some of us to try and attempt this breakthrough, this breach, and perhaps the entry of Palestinians into history, and liberate themselves from the conditions of colonialism and apartheid and military occupation. So that's the primary, let's say, psychological campaign has been focused on that when it comes to at least Palestinian internal political discourse. And of course, having already a political movement like the Palestinian Authority that controls the West Bank, and which hinges itself on the eternality of defeat, that hinges itself on this horizon of defeat as well. It's not surprising that this is the argument from the outset that Palestinians themselves developed. But as the Palestinians themselves developed, it was taken up by, of course, major political stage, media stations like Al Arabiya, for instance. In some instances, also, of course, discourses that emanate from Al Jazeera, but not necessarily in its political commentary, but more in the type and the way it actually covers Gaza more broadly, and at the same time, in, of course, internal political and intellectual disagreements around that. And of course, like, one of the things about Arab intellectual scene, at least from the Nakba onwards, like from 1948 onwards, is that on the one hand, many of the intellectuals that see themselves as people who want to break the illusions of population, who want to show the truth, who are realistic, who are we're advancing arguments, for instance, against Abdel Nasser's political program, Arab nationalism at that moment, which was, hyped up, that was claiming claims around, the ability to defeat Israel, retain Palestine. And many of these intellectuals, in the wake of An-Nakba, which happened in 1967, the 1967 defeat, would find ample room to argue around what is the meaning of defeat itself. I mean, these ideas around defeat have been a constant feature of Arab political thinking, if you want, and Arab political, of course, debates. But it was kind of this intellectual response to the over-exaggeration around power, around these regimes' ability to actually enact a military strategy against Israel, to develop tactics that would be able to confront Israel. And when they failed, these intellectuals were able to show why. And of course, a lot of them, answered through cultural prisms, some answered through other prisms. And there's a huge literature around this question, While that's true, I mean, one of the significant things about this current moment, which I think is different, is that, it's not that people have had a very hyped belief in victory. Of course, on some level, we might argue that when it comes to the performance of Lebanon, specifically Hezbollah or other forces, people perhaps expected more. Maybe, the war didn't really go as these forces wished that it would go. It turned out that Hezbollah, for instance, was much more exposed for intelligence, in terms of intelligence, and also, was able, or Israel and the U.S. and other forces were able to infiltrate, or perhaps, garner as much information through which they enacted this kind of campaign that included walkie-talkies and pagers, and then also, of course, the assassination of the leadership, both military and political, within Hezbollah. But despite that, perhaps one can argue about the ideas of expectations around deterrence, victory, defeat when it comes to some of the political formations there. I think that on some level there is an element of there's a desiring element for defeat, not necessarily only arguing for defeat as, let's look at the conditions on the ground and objectively assess whether this is a defeat or victory. I think that there's among a lot of the intellectual class in the Arab world, among a lot of the Palestinian political operatives within the Arab world, a desire for defeat. Now, this could be partially produced because for many regimes in the region, the idea of the possibility of victory is threatening, because then how do you explain the Israeli-Egyptian peace agreement, or the Jordanian-Israeli peace agreement, or the Abrahamic Accords to your own populations if Israel is actually defeatable? So there's that element of a material interest among Arab comprador classes and leaders in enunciating and repeating the slogan of defeat as the perpetual horizon of the Arabs, and to disavow a politics of defiance and confrontation with Western imperialism or its embodiment of within Israel itself. Now we should work with Israel. It's not defeatable. Let's try to find some sort of accommodation and arrangement with it. So there is that fact. And I think on other levels, for many there's the desire of defeat among Palestinians because it gives you certainty, Because if you're convinced if you're defeated and then you're always going to be defeated, then you don't have to live or hinge your life on this non-victory, non-defeat type of situation where things are uncertain and things could boil down in any way. And this is what is truly radical about October 7th. It's that it opened political possibilities. And at the same time, showed or exhibited, at least for a moment, that Israel is defeatable, and at the same time that it's not invincible as we thought, or perhaps a lot of people thought, and that they, Israelis, like any other people, are people who are vulnerable, and could be outsmarted, could be outthought. You could use tactics against them. You can defy them and perhaps come victorious on some level. And I think for that shocked many who were settled in the certainty of defeat. And their arguments from the outset of the war was, you see, this is what you get when you think you can become victorious or not. That's one element of this binary that I've been speaking about. There's an actual desire for defeat, because again, in defeat, there is some sort of certainty. There's a disavowal of collective politics. You don't have to engage in any type of radical thinking about what is to be done. You can manage your everyday life without, thinking about collective dreams, hopes, etc. And you can take comfort in the, bitter pill of defeat itself. So there's that kind of relationship between defeat and disavowal, if you want. On the other hand, a lot of people were talking about responsibility and abandonment. And here, abandonment I touched upon before, which is the abandonment of the rest of Palestine, of Gaza. I don't think it's an abandonment, but I think a lot of people were arguing that way. And legitimately, that is an argument to be made about why other places in Palestine have not really advanced a more proactive form of defiance and a politics as such, something similar to what happened in May 2021. I think it has to do with, the differences in, organizational capacities between Gaza and the rest of Palestine. And it has to do with, the inability to synchronize between, an active resistance movement that can take decisions on a collective level and engage in military fight, and a people's decision to spontaneously act, which is not really a decision at all, which needs sometimes more than, it lies on a bed of emotions. And emotions are highly fragile things to hinge yourself on, because after October 7th, people might have been excited, at the same time anxious, at the same time fearful, at the same time disoriented. And in that moment, you cannot bet on a spontaneous movement arising, unlike in May 2021, where the Palestinians first had that spontaneous movement arise, and then the armed resistance followed suit. This was the other way around. And I think in most cases, when you have organized political forces like in Gaza engage in a act that also defies, if you want, the expectations from resistance itself, and was successful on October 7th, that is a moment that left people anxious and fearful, specifically when people understood that the Israeli response would be to transgress every norm possible. So in that moment, when you're feeling that you cannot meet the demands of the moment as an individual or as a collective, of course, there are feelings of guilt and shame, disavowal, denial, all of the whole menu of how people feel at that current moment. But there's also there's more leeway for an internalized anger at those who took the decision, because they're the ones that have placed you in this position in the first place. They're the ones that have made you feel naked or weak and vulnerable, or of how left you to suffer the consequences of the decision that was taken on October 7th. So there's more ability or leeway at that particular moment for psychological warfare that assigns responsibility to the armed resistance to make headway among Palestinian population more broadly. Specifically when you have organized forces like the Palestinian Authority and the Arab Gulf regimes and all of these that want to actually assigned that responsibility on the shoulders of the resistance, not on the genocidal actions on Israel, not on its lying campaign and misinformation campaign that we have seen erupt from the beginning, not on American complicity and European complicity. That is not the discussion. The discussion becomes whether Hamas should have done this or not have done this, whether they should be responsible for what's happening in Gaza or shouldn't be responsible for what's happening in Gaza. You know, so that becomes the whole discourse, and I think part of that is because on some level, you know, people will renounce those who perhaps show them that they haven't done enough already in the past, that they haven't prepared themselves well for the moment, that they could have done differently, that victory was in fact possible. You know, like these dynamics are very subtle. They're very, they go through loops and hoops, you know, I would say, but I think sometimes those who are most courageous among the people who have who are more disciplined or organized sometimes end up exposing parts of the vulnerabilities, the complicities on everyday level that people also have engaged in. And sometimes the best way to keep your own sanity is to renounce those who expose you. You know, and we see that. I mean, even on an interpersonal level. I mean, when we see somebody who's more courageous than us, it's not always that we, find a way to like be festive about them or recognize them. I mean, sometimes we find way to put them down, like, or we're jealous of them, or we find a way to like hold them responsible for things, or to blame them for things, or to be cynical around them. I think that is a part of it. I mean, there is a level to that. And that my question is always, Jared, is not why are people engaged in psychological warfare against you? Of course they are. Of course Israel is engaging in cognitive information psychological war. But why does it work?
Right.
What makes it resonant? What makes it echo? So that's a different question than asking, Israel is sending some signals or messaging, or the Arab Gulf regimes is, and this is one of the elements that we should take. Why is that a message capable of making a way cognitively, psychologically among the people? And here I'm not saying only, of course, most Palestinians are for resistance, but at the same time, it's more subtle than just saying this kind of position, which is I'm for resistance or not. No, it's people, when they engage in these discussions, they're engaging in discussions on a level, yes, but I'm for resistance, of course, and my uncle is a martyr and my father is a martyr and blah blah blah. But was this the right decision? Shouldn't Hamas take responsibility for what? That's a discussion that is happening on the streets of the West, but also in Gaza and everywhere else, even in Jenin and other places. And to be honest, I think that the sheer brutality of Israeli force, coupled with its ability to get away with everything that it has been committing a Deir Yassin and Sabra and Shatila massacre every day, torturing prisons and humiliating them, and all of the this different sadistic regime, although it has always been sadistic, but this intensification of that sadism and brutality, and coupled with also feeling abandoned even from resistance forces that have given what they had, but had to withdraw from the fight for one reason or another, are leaving people with this forms of question even more intensely, and is capable of redefining, at least for now, people's orientation. I think that's why, just generally and collectively, when people ask why the West Bank is not doing anything, it's, of course, there's fear, but there's a lot of disorientation, and also a lot of rethinking around the consequences of resistance as such. And I think on that level, the psychological warfare, found an echo. Let's put it that way.
Man, that was, yeah, thank you. I mean, this is really interesting because in a lot of ways, obviously, this is what I'm about to where I'm about to go with this conversation is quite a leap, but in a lot of ways, there's I think a lot of resonances to it, right? Because part of what I wanted to do today too is to talk with you about what's going on in the US context, which I know, I mean, you follow, you've written about, Trump in relation to Netanyahu and, all of this stuff. Um, but there's been a debate, and a lot of times I don't get too into online debates, but there's been a debate around tactics lately. There's been a debate around organizations and whether they're doing what they need to do, whether they're doing what's been asked of them by the Palestinian resistance, whether there should be more effort taken to disrupt weapons manufacturers, to stop the flow of weapons through ports and so on, or whether people should keep doing national marches and, marching, demanding, statements, petitions, so on and so forth. Obviously, like this comes in a climate where, one, what you laid out with the context of Gaza at the beginning of the show, you know, things are quite desperate, in terms of the situation there. And, even mutual aid efforts, I think people are starting to wonder, like, if food's not getting into Gaza, then, what are we doing? If we can't get the siege broken, right? Another example of a thing that might, people might think about tactically of how do we address. Um, and you talked about too this the problem that you talked about is one of the problems too that comes up in these discussions, which is, we're not ready for the level of repression that would come if we take more aggressive action, right? This is an argument that people would make. Um, and then you have other folks, who are promoting more aggressive action, promoting more direct action, more confrontation. And these forces they disagree on a lot of things. Some of it's politics, some of it's personal, some of it's, all of the above, right? But I think that it one of the things that you spoke to is that sometimes the people who take the most aggressive action, right, are also that there's something that happens with those of the rest of us who aren't doing that. Where, yeah, some of us might say, yeah, long live, glory to, et cetera, et cetera. Like we're on board. We support even if we don't engage in that ourselves. And some people, would say, well, that's adventurism, or that's, you know, those people are acting immaturely, or they're putting people in harm's way. And, it's those are not I don't want to dismiss any of that, any of those concerns on either side of the equation out of hand. And I also want to say it's in a time where, and I do want to do some more discussion of this in future episodes as well, where there's an attack on speech. There's even it's even to the level, and this is something I want to dig into further on, like further podcasts, is, podcasters and streamers are getting things constantly now in terms of terms and conditions and community guidelines and things like this that try to stop us from speaking about armed resistance, or say that if we speak about it, that we can only speak about it in a neutral or condemnatory tone. Um, and so this is happening. At the same time, you have students who obviously are on visas, who have been, either detained, deported, pushed into a position where they've had to self-deport, or they've chosen to self-deport because they knew that the alternative was likely detention and more, a harder road and so on. And so there's a general attack on speech. There's certainly a general attack on universities, and especially the allowance of spaces within universities that can be pro-Palestinian, is the way I would put it. Because I think that that's clearly the issue that's being targeted most directly, even though they might use some more general terms or some terms about, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or anti-racism or whatever else, right? So that's kind of the context, and I think that I don't really know my question for you, other than I'm just interested in your thoughts on these issues in this time.
Well, look, I mean, if we had to prove that Palestine is so intricately connected to, the war on universities that the right wing seeks or sought out for a long time now, because they see universities as a hub for radical thinking and thought and all of that type of things. I mean, now it's manifested. Now you see how Palestine is more than itself, that it can create these forms of institutional fights. Sometimes it's not even a fight at all, because we see complicity between the heads of the institutions and the Trump, for example, administration. And I think for me, I mean, seeing Colombia concede to Trump in the way that it did, or even legal firms in like Paul Weiss, a legal firm in the US, you see the relationship exactly of liberals and new forms of fascism. And it's like, please come and threaten us so we can concede everything for you. I mean, that is a dynamic that is happening, and it will still happen. I think the space for speaking about Palestine in the U.S. is being constantly negotiated and contested. And I think that with somebody like Trump, who really is flirting with forms of police power that perhaps haven't been there in the same way that it's being enacted now. I'm not sure about that. You might correct me, because probably a lot of the forms of what now the liberal media is making a fuss about has been already out there for a long time. But at least engaging in these deportation of the universities, tarnishing their reputation also in terms of attracting international students, withdrawing funding. And there are some signs of things that are new and novel, creating a lot of disorientation and uncertainty for a lot of, American green card holders, trying to, there's a threat against, the Arab community that is largely, or Muslim community more broadly, that have perhaps a lot of family members that are not yet citizens, or have immigration status that is not doesn't completely protect them from deportation. So everybody just buckles down and stays quiet and moves on. But I think more broadly, Jared, it's a sign that these movements had an impact. Of course, it's an opportunity again for power to assert itself in new ways, to engage in these kind of war and fights internally. But it also shows that there's something around Palestine that has shifted, where you need to hammer it down. So on the one hand, they're using Palestine for other ends and goals. I think that is part of the equation here, because they know that the liberals will concede because it's Palestine, and they won't, fight back, because now we're just deporting students who are engaged in these protests. But slowly they will, expand that criteria. On the other hand, I think that on the level of discourse, on the level of popular opinion, on the level of American public sentiment towards Israel, there's something that has shifted and that needs to be, threatened with the violence of the courts, the violence of deportation, and the violence of labeling people with anti-Semitic labels. So that's what's occurring on some level in terms of, like, let's say the cultural hegemonic ideological form of struggle. And that's why I think that if you think a protest doesn't matter, I mean, of course it's not going to end the war in Gaza. I mean, if your theory of change was, by protesting we're going to change the elites or the American administration's position on Palestine, I don't think that that's going to happen anytime soon. Not with Trump, probably not with any Democratic also president, because we can see to the extent to which Zionist interest and the relationship between the empire and Israel is so entrenched that it's hard to break in terms of consensus. But it says something about the system that Americans live in, the system that sustains this form of relationship on the backs and the bones of the Palestinians, of course, other peoples in the region, of course, and also on the expense of Americans themselves. You know, that's the reality of what's unfolding in front of our eyes. And I think if that theory of change was the one that is driving the protests, it was the wrong, perhaps, theory, or perhaps it wasn't completely well thought of. I think the protests are, more about opening spaces and cracks, perhaps, perhaps for a new movement that might arise. I mean, the Democrats are in disarray. They're arguing amongst themselves what the future of the Democratic Party is. I mean, there's a lot of different cracks happening. Bernie Sanders is going on a tour with, AOC. Everybody's trying to place their bets on whatever forms of politics that can, engage in. But at the same time, if there's active social and political movements, these active social political movements have to be taken seriously and have an impact. And sometimes they change culture, sometimes they change opinions, sometimes they also create problems for any Democratic or even Republican administration in terms of continued military and political support for Israel, at least if we want to maintain the pretense of democracy. But what it seems to me, at least on some level, is that perhaps the American establishment is willing to give up democracy on the altar of Israel. I'm not sure if that's the way they would see it, but at least that's on some level that's what's occurring here. So I don't think that there's any act that is useless, and I have a very open and receptive position on people acting, and I'm not one of those that says this is the only form of action, or that's the only form of action, or this is radical and this is not radical enough. I know that people disagree about this, but I'm the type that says that as long as people are acting, then they're doing something at least. I mean, that's a minimum. We say this is the minimum form of faith, in Arabic, adaf al-iman, like it's the minimum form of faith of doing something. And of course, some acts may perhaps have no utility, or perhaps they're more about your own psychic health, and sometimes it's about your own guilt, and sometimes it's I get all of these arguments. They don't really change radically the world. I get that, but I am also very wary of any form of radical nihilism, radical thinking that only leads us towards doing nothing. Or if we're not doing the thing that nobody can do or doesn't have the courage to do, then everybody's not, doing anything at all. So I think that, there's still this kind of naive, childish part of me that says people should act. And when the state is engaging in a war against speech, against demonstrations, against an ideological fight, a cultural fight, then I think that actually even heightens up the need for more protests, the need for more engagement on the part of the solidarity movement on the ground and beyond. And I think actually this is the moment for it, more than any time before, even when Biden was there, even when Antony Blinken was leading the State Department. This is the moment for people to have more say about also what goes in their institutions on the level of movements, and engaging in actual cultural and ideological fight against the American administration and what it's trying to do when it comes to Palestine, and finding a pushback. And I think would be important. And our bet in Palestine has always been on people's movements, not on political and policy changes on the level of empire, on people's movements, on student movements, on indigenous movements, on movements that have at the center a desire to change the world and to see the other as a human and to create new possibilities for life on this planet that is different than the one based on capitalism and exploitation and racism and all that comes with it, and where Palestine has also a place in that system overall. So I think that is our bet, and perhaps it's a wager that we'll lose, but at least that's the only bet that we really have. Because I don't think an American president will wake up one morning and say, "Oh, I feel guilty about what's happening in Palestine. Let's shift policy, or change the ground." And I think it shows you the more the administration is resistant to this type of change, the more important it is, and the fact that radical change or a radical change in that position is actually a changing of the world itself. This is what Palestinians like Ghassan Kanafani said before, that for Palestine to be free, the world has to change, not only Palestine itself. So, I mean, again, yeah, I think this is the time for it. At least this is personally how I would view it.
I appreciate that. I also appreciate, what folks have said too, in terms of like whatever we feel in terms of the repression or the lack of, freedom that we're feeling in this moment is totally incomparable to, even your position in the West Bank, but also to, folks in Gaza, certainly, so, I mean, obviously, I think that that's another argument to act in the ways that people feel that they can. I mean, the other thing I would say too is that like one of the things that this moment has exposed probably more than any moment I can recall too is just like how many people are really deeply invested in a culture of death, a culture of just like a kind of what I would call a sort of liberal or conservative nihilism, and just sort of, I mean, the number of people who are excited about deportations, who watch massacres in Gaza and, actually are cheering them on, is something that, I wasn't really prepared because I'm not, I like to think that Americans, kind of are not, that they sort of have pushed a lot of the evil things that this empire has done out of their consciousness, and that's the way that they kind of move through the world and can exist, right? Is that they kind of have to repress it to a certain degree in order to function, and so there's when they don't want to talk about it, I give a little bit of grace to people's minds that they're probably doing that to try to kind of like, if I start to question this too much, it's going to unravel my whole, worldview and system. And it just can't, you're asking me to take a leap off an edge that I'm not ready. I don't think there's anything there to catch me if I go. And I don't think that anymore. I mean, I think there are some people that way, but I think that I'm increasingly disturbed by the number of people who actually are quite aware of the abyss and are like happy to shove others, into it. And it's not just a conservative neocon kind of politic, although it certainly aligns with that that worldview. And it's I don't want to overemphasize how much it is, because if you look at social media or stuff like that, a lot of this can be manipulative. There's a lot of bots, there's all of these things. You don't actually always know that the people that you're looking at are even real people. But I feel like it's a larger phenomenon, and I think it also clarifies for or should clarify for people on the left or people who consider themselves anti-imperialist or pro-Palestine, that there's a number of areas of society where it doesn't make sense to try to build alignments, which is not to say that they shouldn't keep trying. They should, but like not with those people. Because there are certain people who really just wish you ill and who are like trying to find the next person that they can deport or denaturalize or um assign blame to. Again, it's a similar phenomenon to what you were talking about this idea of blaming Hamas. There's this blaming of people um for supposedly supporting Hamas, right? Which in some cases they do, and in some cases that's not even what's um, you know, not even relevant really to the discussion. So yeah, anyway, that's just been on my mind. I don't know if you have anything on that. I have another question I can ask you if not.
No, I don't have much on it, but I think that what you're hinting towards is that what form of coalitions or alliances and that comes again with organizations, no? An organization can determine that much more better than individuals. I mean, if you're just fighting it out individually on Twitter, it's you can say whatever you want. But organizations or people, at least placing themselves within collectives, can have an opinion around what coalitions or alliances they should enact. On the part of people taking joy with what's happening in Gaza, I'm not surprised, Jared, because having lived in the West Bank, and when we know, first of all, we understand the extent to which sadistic pleasure is part of the psychic, if you want, orientation of the settler, no, and the army personnel. There's a lot of that going on. I mean, we're generally surprised when a soldier is a humane type of figure, no. It's like, this is, oh wow, this is a good soldier. That's what we call him, no. But in general, that sadistics, uh, uh, pleasure that you take with power over people, or making them live in uncertain time. I mean, even the West Bank, where you just close the checkpoint and watch as people get crammed up in a traffic and start fighting each other because everybody wants to pass the other, and you take pleasure in that. This is the scene on which your whole life hinges, and where you feel your own power and you feel your own sense of necessarily security, and brutalizing and manipulating and lying and engaging in these acts and getting away with it is also a childish pleasure, if we go back to childhood. No, I mean, getting away with things and doing things. So there's that element. I don't think is to me surprising that humans are capable of taking pleasure with the destruction of this fictive other that they take out on a young girl in Gaza who's being killed by bombs from air. I think that some people look at that and they find in it that's what should be done, and for some others they look at it and they take pleasure in it. For some they look at it and perhaps they will ask questions about what type of government or world they live in, no? But and it's not surprising, of course, that there's also a whole different set of actors, think tanks, intellectuals within conservative right-wing groups who are looking at Israel as an example of what should be done elsewhere, of the type of wars that America should be engaged in without apologies, without hesitations, without pretensions of legal constraints, without this whole liberal framework of we attacked an hospital, but it was a mistake, or we mistakenly bombed a wedding. I think that for many who went through Afghanistan and Iraqi wars, they're coming out with a different conclusion. We didn't win because we didn't use whatever power we had. And if you read them, you understand that for them, Israel is an exciting experiment, one that they want to emulate, push to its limits and extremes, because this is an example that can be taken in fighting wars whenever they erupt for the American military and empire more broadly. So I think that that's an argument that is making its way, and I think that's the argument that is, probably going to win among military think tanks and people who are operating on that level. I'm not sure. I mean, there was the whole discussion around pagers, for instance, and whether these forms of attack should, Western intelligence agencies also adopt in their, wars with Russia or China, or possible engagement with their own enemies. And there's disagreements around whether this is, a sanctioned, legal, moral form of attack or not. But again, Israel, in that sense, is a place and is engaging with this Muslim, Arab, enemy that is easily expendable and killable on the one hand, doesn't have the stature of a human enough to be, be valued within this kind of, hierarchy of humans that we live in the world. So there's a pleasure in defeating this old fictive imagined enemy called Islam and the Arabs more broadly that took the Mediterranean and defeated the Byzantine Empire and then moved all the way to Europe. But at the same time, I think that Israel is setting this kind of contemporary conditions for war in the future. And I think for a lot of military people looking at this, they're excited about it. They're excited about attacking hospitals. They're excited about being able to take out and kill the city. Like, why should we do counterinsurgency that tries to separate the population from, armed factions? No, we should just clear out the village. That's the argument. I mean, and it's a very simple argument because, for a lot of these military men, they look, we have all of these bombs, we have all of these bullets, we have all of these weapons, and you're telling me I cannot use them. So I need to make the argument that I should use them without hesitation. And I think that is where, unfortunately, the use of military power in the contemporary world will go towards.
I think you're right. I think that's the intention. I think, I've been trying to think through, for instance, what does the defunding of USAID mean? Why would they do this? This is the CIA's soft power, massive aid organization. It's been used for all kinds of, CIA operations over the years, but it also, even if you read just their own handbooks, the Counterinsurgency Field Manual, they talk about USAID as something that helps them in counterinsurgency. It helps them to provide aid and to develop and so on to target populations as a way of trying to separate them away from the insurgents, right? But so if you get rid of that, right, you're saying this is not a weapon that we want to use anymore. We don't want to engage in warfare in that way. Now, maybe that means that, they're just saying, hey, this has been funded by the state. We can get NGOs and nonprofits to do this, and then we don't have to use our government. That could be one argument, is that they're just saying, like, somebody else will take on that role. The army and the, U.S. government doesn't have to directly do it. But I think I'm leaning more towards where I hear you going, which is there are these counterinsurgency books that are just like, look, giving people the right to vote, doing aid and development work, doing this kind of stuff, it doesn't actually work very well. And what we need to do is kill more people, and to be more violent and to impose such a reality upon the targeted population that they turn away from the insurgents because their lives are made so miserable and so many of their friends and family are killed for supporting this thing. And I think that's, if there's an example that's, if you think of what's happening in Gaza as emblematic or a paradigm shift or any of that, I think that's that's the question, right? Is whether this is the way that wars will be fought from now on. And and I think it's also, if we think about it in the United States context, there's a lot of state agencies being defunded within the United States as well. And obviously, we know there's a lot more money going into police and going into these cop cities and all of these things, as well as, I think this is the other wager around this, is technology, right? Is that like all of this, the internet, cell phones, surveillance infrastructure that we've created, we can use this with AI and everything else as military infrastructure, and we can use this to suppress any kind of rebellion or insurgency and so on. And so that's the kind of wager I see being made by the United States, and certainly Israel has made that kind of wager, I would say. And it's a question around the kind of global military thought, where that will land within their own doctrines, I guess, and how much that will be taken up over time. I don't know if you have anything you want to say on that.
No, I mean, I agree. I have, yeah, again, I don't have much. I mean, I think, no, I think, look, I mean, one paradigm of just practicing force and hard power, and, taking away these elements of soft power, if you want, and ideological makeup of the world, and convincing people of American power and its awesomeness, and that is, of course, part of this USAID mission, no? And of course, it hinges back towards, if somebody defies us, we'll just use force. We don't need to be have this kind of good guy attitude, like you mentioned. There is an element to that, but I'm not sure to what extent everything that Trump does is like well thought of on that level. Like I'm sure there's a lot of operatives around him that have these kind of ideological inclinations about the type of force and power and how to organize relationships with the world, etc. But I'm not sure if Trump has that, foresight of things. I think he's just interplaying with this, American sensibility that why are we involved in the world on some level? No, there's this kind of contradictory, isolationist tendency among conservatives, but at the same time, we're the strongest country in the world and everybody should obey us. And at the same time, we don't want to engage in the world, and we want to just be concerned about America and the American industrial base and American workers. And so there's this kind of two poles that operate in tandem. And for a lot of reasons, the USAID kind of like it's this waste that has gone to people around the world. We're spending money on things we shouldn't be spending on. And it comes alongside, Musk's attack against, the bureaucratic administrative state, and trying their best to put people on hold, to loosen any resistance to any moves that the Trump administration is making by, making everybody's job not secure. I think that is a power play that they're, playing partially to make Trump decisions flow much easier with very little resistance from the administrative state itself. And partially, of course, they're claiming that they're cutting budgets and, around excess and, spending. Although I think the first part is more important, because I think Trump learned from his first term that the administrative state has a power and that you should attack it to be able to get away with more and more of your policies, because it ends up, you can take a decision, but that decision could end up being watered down quite a lot when it's executed on the level of the bureaucracy or on the level of the administrative state itself. So there's a lot of these maneuvers going on, and you see these internal coups like happening in Israel, happening in Europe as well. The change in the balance between courts and executive power and Congress, and and you guys are much more aware of what's happening in the United States more than me. But at least for from my view in Palestine, as I look at the changing world, whatever direction we take it, in terms of it becoming more right-wing fascist, less, if you want, democratic, whatever term we use to describe this change, or whether we go back to like political economy theories to explain how, capitalism is shifting, and the rise of China and how it impacts the United States, the feeling of insecurity among a lot of American elites about, China making headway with technologies, with its military and its buildup of its military, but also, really contesting America on technological grounds, which I think Americans are slowly but steadily feeling that the Chinese can pull more and more tricks in terms of, advanced AI technology, neuroscience, things around electric cars. The Chinese are showing some of their agility on a technological level, and that's making a lot of American elites feel insecure, and specifically elites tied to the empire and the way it's run. But beyond that, Jared, I think that one of the elements is simply less of, this kind of like grand scheme of things. I think for a lot of within the military, people who went to Iraq and Afghanistan, or it's a matter of like feeling, everybody's saying we were defeated, but we were not defeated. We defeated ourselves because we didn't use whatever we had to use. We didn't make them surrender like we should have made them. I think that is one of the, not the only reaction to these wars, but that's one of the reactions among some of the more right-wing military people. And they're rereading their own history of engagement in counterinsurgency or engaging in these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they're saying their problem is around the hesitancy of using force. So I think this is where Israel is, echoes. It's less of it's less of an issue of it's this military captains and people who are in the Navy or in the Army or in the Air Force, and saying we should just have used more of our power. We shouldn't have cared that much around legitimating our military action through this kind of liberal discourse. We need to change the discourse. There is a level to that, is like the internal contradictions within how the military devises its own strategy and tactics, and how it enacts itself in these theaters of operation, and then the conclusions that come across. And I think for many of those, instead of questioning, for instance, why are we in Iraq and Afghanistan, that was our mission. We didn't complete that mission because it's a failure on the part of the politics and the political machine and the media, and we need a change of culture and institutions to be able to get these wars also done. And for them, Israel is, an exemplar model of how things should be done. And I think that's the danger, is that they will play a role from a pragmatic policy point as military technical people that conduct such actions, and they will be arguing within the military for these changes. But at the same time, they will be met with less and less resistance as people normalize things like what's happening in Gaza, a massacre on everyday level, creating destruction and the killing of an entire city, using total siege tactics. These are things we haven't seen, at least in this form, mediated through social media daily for a long time. Vietnam perhaps was one of the places where aerial bombardment on that level was taking place. But this is the thing about war. A lot of things that also the internet emerged from wars, and from the military. A lot of the technologies emerge from wars. Surveillance emerges from wars. How to organize data sets. AI is also a solution to the flow of data and the need to organize it in a way that makes sense for a human operative. So wars are also a place where a lot of defining features of the future come about. And I think this is why we should take war itself as a category also seriously.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, there was the whole, even during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, there was critiques all along of David Petraeus, who helped, shepherd the counterinsurgency doctrine that was developed as this Ivy League, kind of outsider who wanted to do this liberal version of war. And, this also goes back to Vietnam. I mean, there were people who thought that as brutal as Vietnam War was, in which, a million plus, maybe 2 million Vietnamese people were killed, that the US had the capacity to just take care of it, to just wipe everybody out, and that they held back, and that was the real problem. And so, yeah, I appreciate you, situating that discourse, because it is always there within, military minds and so on. A couple things. So I also, yeah, I agree with this, Adim. The structural dynamics of contemporary empire and processes of accumulation do not solely hinge on intentionality or rationality of specific actors, and I think that is true. Chidi Macha had a great comment. None of what has happened in Gaza came as a surprise. The response of empire, or the lack of empathy. Ida B. Wells writing changed my worldview decades ago, and nothing has countered it, unfortunately. Yeah, I mean, if you think about the sadistic, carnivalesque pleasure of lynching and so on that was taken by white settlers, it shouldn't be that surprising. There's a part of me that would love to think that we're past that, and I think that's probably, if anything, the part that's most distressing about this, is that it's clearly that same sadism still exists. And Roberto, I think, summarized that well. Many illusions have been shattered. The way forward is via an honest reckoning of the situation we face. Not everyone is evil, of course, but humanity is full of impulses we must take into account. All right, so Francis posed a question early on that I did want to come back to, because I think it is important, of just some discussion, a little bit of what's internal dynamics within Israel that you're seeing in this moment. We've kind of alluded to some of that, but not totally. And then Yemen. I mean, Yemen has continued to support as they can. They continue to send missiles towards Tel Aviv, and the blockade, obviously, and of course the United States military, which I think should be said, because there was all of this I'll just say stupid discourse about the fact that the signal chat got leaked to the editor of The Atlantic, who is a IDF prison guard, veteran, about that from a lens of process, which I realize with military people and national security people, that they care about that, of course, but lost in any discussion of that in the mainstream is like, why are we bombing Yemen? What is, should we be doing that? Is that, and it's not surprising. This is totally par for the course now from how war is covered in the United States, but there's not any there's rarely any discussion beyond something as simple as saying, well, the terrorist Houthis need to be confronted, or similar to the same kind of language that's used with Hamas. So anyway, yeah, those 2 points, Israel and Yemen, if you have some thoughts.
Well, look, on Yemen, I think from the outset of the war, what was the strategy of American and Europeans more broadly was to minimize the impact of the Houthi Ansar Allah semi-blockade of the Red Sea. And the media just simply ignored it. I mean, very little information on the extent of damage to the world economy, very little information or highlighting of how, European and American consumers are paying the price of and the brunt of backing Israel at this particular moment. The media just completely ignored that, the blockade has caused hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of the transportation and cost, and adding to the inflationary pressure that is part of the problem since COVID, at least in Western economies. So that is one element of it. There's a complete dismissal of that, complete dismissal of the idea that the Yemenis are acting in solidarity of Gaza and acting to stop genocide. And much of the Western media also dismisses that. I think when it comes to Yemen, it seems that the Trump administration is basically using the same type and forms of attacks that the Biden administration used, perhaps with more intelligence information that they have been gathering since the outbreak of Ansar Allah campaign in the Red Sea. I don't really, and I can't assess really the impact of these bombardment campaigns, or whether they're able to really destroy any assets significant or actually assassinate people. There's very little information also coming from Ansar Allah itself around these, and perhaps more people are equipped to do that. But at least for now, Ansar Allah continues to act, whether in the Red Sea or every couple of days, also sending ballistic missiles towards Israel, and also disrupting life there, and forcing people within Israel to go to shelters, which is, it creates this kind of scene of havoc, at least, and reminds people that they're in war, because I think that's the significant element of that operation, at least on some level. Although Israel, I think, also somewhat minimizes the damages from these rockets and tries to dismiss that it's not working, and I don't think that's completely correct. Even when it comes to missiles coming from Yemen, I think some of them are actually, penetrating the missile defense systems, at least from observation using my eye. But who knows? I mean, there's a minimization, at least, of these the impact of these missiles. That's when it comes to Yemen. I don't think there is anything necessarily to be worried of, unless there is significant damage to Ansar Allah. Maybe you had something, Jared, to say on that.
Oh, it was just, I can't remember where I saw this report, but there was a report in Western media within the last day. I want to say it may have been the New York Times, which I don't encourage anyone to support or read, but that essentially the attacks on Yemen are not degrading Ansar Allah's capabilities. That they're not, that and this was based on what they claimed was reporting, talking to basically U.S. military folks off the record, kind of thing. That publicly the administration is saying, hey, we're degrading them. Their capabilities are extremely diminished, etc. But when you talk to military folks, off without giving their name and so on, they're like, no, it's not doing that. So I don't know, but that I just wanted to throw that in there for folks, that at least even within the Western press, there is skepticism that the campaign is doing much of anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only move that might have an impact, which is not only in terms of intelligence and perhaps assassinations of key personnel or leaders, or destruction of, I don't know, some assets that are important to the Ansar Allah general operation more broadly. I think the significant move would be a reigniting of the Yemeni, civil war, some sort of Saudi backing around that, some sort of attempt at a coup. So these are the signs. If there's a feeling that Ansar Allah is weakened, or that there could be some sort of attack from within Yemeni forces more receptive to Saudi Emirati interest, that might take on Ansar Allah at this particular juncture. That's a real play that the Americans and the Saudis and others might have when it comes to Ansar Allah. But other than that, I think that the bombing campaigns will be, of course, hurtful and destructive, but not sure will convince the Ansar Allah leadership to back off from their campaign. Yeah, I mean that's my assessment generally. But again, I'm not the best suited to really discuss the specificities of what's happening in Yemen, because it's an entire world on of itself, and it needs somebody who follows it more deeply than myself.
No, thank you. Did you have more you wanted to say on Israel?
Well, I think like when it comes to Israel, again, there's, as I said before, there is some sort of let's say an internal coup. I wouldn't call it like that, because it's not a coup necessarily. It's just that the right wing is driving power within Israel. I think that they're remaking and redefining the relationship between the executive power and the state. The moves by Netanyahu to fire, for instance, the head of the Shabak, which was never done in Israeli history. Some were forced to resign, but there was never this kind of outright firing of Shabak. Shabak is the internal intelligence agency within Israel.
It's kind of like the FBI in our context, I guess, right?
Yeah, I mean, but it's kind of like the FBI, but because they
because
control,
Palestinians are an internal enemy, then it's
exactly. Yeah. I mean, so they have a colonial military role. I mean, it's not only policing in the specific set of America, although perhaps there are similarities as well on the role of the FBI in surveilling, political movements, and but they're more focused. Generally, most of Shabak's resources is focused on counterintelligence but more precisely on colonial policing within the West Bank and of course Gaza. Organizing information networks and arresting people and interrogating them and things like that. But firing the Shabak head, firing the also the state attorney, trying to engage in a legal warfare around judges' appointments. It's something very close to what also Trump is doing. It's the same kind of handbook, but in Netanyahu's own way, and making sure that there's less check and balances. At the same time, there's of course pushback from this security network, including investigations around Netanyahu aides taking money from Qatar and laundering it and using it, or Qataris funding some of the aides around Netanyahu as part of a campaign of influence that the Qataris were engaged in. It's called in Israel Qatar Gate. So there's all these wars happening at the same time. What's happening within Israeli street is that most of the Israeli public now is against a renewal of the war in Gaza. Many of the fighting units, reserve units are, unprepared or unwilling to really go in Gaza, not out of humanitarian concerns for Gazans, but out of, economic hardship. A lot of those have, lost their jobs. Many Israelis are looking forward to a life without the constant, need to go to war or engage in fights in terms of, armed or ground maneuvering. And still, Israel is engaging in this kind of expansive war in Syria, taking up more land. It's still, it's still in Lebanon. The army is still stretched in many ways, and a lot of soldiers are called for war in Gaza as well at this current moment. So it's still in this kind of semi-mobilized state, and of course with the rockets and barrages. So many Israelis are now, within the context of priorities, want the return of their captives within Gaza, less the continuation of the war, which means the right wing is also engaged in this war, but with not as much public sentiment and support of it as was before. That's at least the internal dynamic in terms of how the moves around Gaza can also be figured in terms of whether really the army will engage in a ground fight and stay there for the long term, and heeding the calls of the right wing to resettle Gaza and ethnically cleanse, or whether it's a negotiating tactic around extracting more Israeli prisoners without a real end to the war, or whether it's a wait and see approach to open the possibility of perpetual as a means to also attack Iran and drag America into it and heighten the tension in the region. That is part of the play, at least within Israeli society. I think Israeli society at this current moment, because the major intense period of the struggle has subsided, for many it's a return to like routine and everyday life, but within the context of a sense that they have also lost a lot of their credibility and grounding in the world, and a lot of disgust with their actions and acts at this particular moment. And I think many in the liberal, at least left circles, are very focused on what I would call redemptive acts, which is trying their best to now engage in discourses around Palestinian human suffering and more about what happened in the Gaza war and the human cost of it, and these forms of kind of crying about the victims that you've created after the fact of the massacre, but at the same time trying through the centralization of very minimal Israeli voices, like Gideon Levy or Amira Hass, people who seem to have some sort of consciousness around living with Israel and always talk about the Palestinian predicament one way or another, or Yuval Abraham, who was part of the Oscar-winning movie No Other Land. I think this is type of redemptive acts where the Israeli comes across as a person who has a conscience, who can redeem even Zionism itself through his acts of defiance against state policy, etc. Whether with whatever they say. And so there's that focus as well among much of what we can call some sort of Zionist left within Israel. But that's what I'm seeing. There is an internal real fight within Israel, and I think thus far the right wing is winning. There's no signs of life among what is called the left in Israel. It's winning. It's being able to garner much headway in terms of its agenda, policies, and the remaking of institutions, and the relationship between the executive and legal or legislative branches. But to be also precise, if elections were happening today, we're not sure who would actually win the elections in Israel. So there's a sense of disorientation because, at least to much of Israeli public, the current government is also a failed government that should be held accountable for much of what happened since October 7th.
Thank you for all of that. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on today?
No, I mean, for me, I'm good. If you're good.
Thank you so much. Megan, thanks for becoming a supporter. Appreciated. Just food for thought. The flow of weapons stems from the port of New Orleans. Do with that what you will. I will say, yeah, next week we have a couple of conversations. I just want to say a couple of things about them. With Alex Savinia on Monday, we'll be talking about this propaganda series, Lioness, which is just totally unhinged, and we'll have fun while also spending a lot of time criticizing it, critiquing it, and talking about what it says about kind of the psyche of empire in this moment. And then on Thursday, Dr. CBS Sharice Burdenstelli will be here, and we'll be talking about Red Scare or Black Scare, Red Scare, her book. But we're going to talk about it in the context of the repression that's going on right now as well, because so many of the mechanisms, which actually relates to something you referenced much earlier in the conversation, Abdaljawad, so many of the mechanisms we're seeing of denaturalizing, deporting, etc., have a very long history with anti-left, state repression in the United States. And she's going to talk about that in particular with the repression of a lot of Black communists, Black radical figures, and we'll connect it into what's going on today. So looking forward to that as well. These are always great discussions. It is diabolical. Yeah. We'll be talking about the Diabolical series, Lioness, and we'll be talking a little bit about Taylor Sheridan, who's its creator too, who's like just does a million different series that are extremely popular, and his ideology is what we'll be talking about to some degree. All right, so again, thank you so much for this. Appreciated. And we'll make sure that it's not 2 months before we do it again. There's a lot to talk about and unpack, and I'm sure you'll be writing more. So looking forward, and definitely encourage people, please read the article if you have not. It's excellent. All right. Thanks again, Aboud.
Thank you, Jared.